I noticed though that immersion students tend to get stuck in just one way of saying things that they learn in lower level, lower grade, and they continuously use that form as they go up the grade. And so they hit my 4th grade class, and then they, for example, when they compare something, they say, this is this, but this is that. They don't use any words like in contrast or in comparison to or any of that, similarity, difference, things like that. And what's worse was that native speakers of Japanese get stuck in that as well. And they're saying it the same way, and I say, wait a minute, your language forms are very, simple. What happened? Well, obviously the academic rigor was missing in their sentence forms. So I needed to combat this phenomenon with explicitly implementing target language sentence structures that facilitate rigorous academic discourse in my immersion classroom. Example of that is language objectives. I needed to be very clear in what I'm going to teach and introduce the language elements in that lesson. So, for example, I'm going to definitely introduce this form that's grade level appropriate, much higher than what they've been using, and they're going to use this particular form to learn mineral and express what they understand about mineral. So that's one, and the other has been sentence frames, just a great tool by Dr. Kate Kinsella. It's a sentence stems, if you will, closed sentences in which we could sort of build in academic rigor. And they can use that sentence form to produce language and can explain what they understand in that content area. A good example is the linear equation. For example, y equals 2x, and then say, a lot of times my students will use conditional to do that. So if y is, if x is 2, then y is 4. So it's very if and then kind of conditional, but they've known that for so long. If then. So what if they can use when clause? When the x is this, then the y will be that. There's some tense variety in there, other rigor, academic rigor in there. So I would be a little bit thankful, if you will, more thankful about what kind of language they're going to produce in my classroom. Thank you.
Okay. One of the guys of effective teach, effective learn, I think one of the things that guides me as I'm doing this is really understanding that it's a standards-based. That no matter what I'm doing, I'm working toward certain standards. And that to also have an understanding of what are research-based theories and strategies that are effective to use these kinds of things. I think that's one of the keys of also being an effective teaching. One of the ones that I always identify with is Vygotsky, which I mentioned earlier. And his whole idea that language is developed in the context of social, in the context of social, meaningful conversations. And for an example, one of the things that I do in literature, when I read with my students, we actually read whole books. I don't read excerpts, just a part of the story. So for example, in 8th grade, when they're reading Don Quixote, we don't just read about the windmills, we read about all the other adventures he had. And really it's that I've come to the conclusion that I can teach the standards, the reading strategies that the reading standards are supposed to learn in the context of authentic reading. So that's what I tend to do. So when we are talking about how a character develops or influences the story itself, and we start talking about his personality versus his physical traits and which one has a greater effect on the story and on the conflict, and which one are the ones that are foretelling or foreshadowing the events that are to come, we use that kind of academic language, and this is the kind of academic language they have when they're speaking in their groups amongst themselves. So again, it's the other part of Vygotsky that talks about the zone of proximal development, which is what a student is capable of doing on their own versus what they're capable of doing with the help of a more capable peer. Now that other peer could be another student in the classroom, it could be a teacher, but it's keeping them in that challenge zone per se that I'm really trying to keep students all the time. So for example, when we're working on writing, and I always go from reading, I start with reading, and then the themes that come out of the reading is what I use for the topics in writing. And then when we work on the writing, of course, I split it up between the rhetoric and the conventions. But when I get to conventions, it's explicit instruction of the grammar. So I do teach my students things like what's a coordinate conjunction, a subordinate conjunction, dependent clause, independent clause, what's a fragment, what's a run-on sentence. And all of this in the context of their own writing, because the one thing I discovered from years ago was I can either spend 6 hours grading all their essays and giving it back to them, and two things would happen. Either it would come back with all the same mistakes they made the first time before I graded it, or it would come back perfect with all the corrections I made. In either case, they didn't learn anything. So it was really about teaching them what they needed to know in order for them to be able to correct their own mistakes. So really that's the way I approach it, and I teach the students these kinds of, what I see as a commonality amongst the majority of the students, that's what I address. And then when I have the majority working on those mistakes, then I can small group instruction with someone who may have a different issue going on. And that way, when they go back and they're working in their groups, there's meaningful interaction, there's a purpose to what they're doing, and the language that they're using is that academic language. But again, it goes back to making sure that it's in the context of authentic communication. Something else that Andrew mentioned was the idea of the vocabulary. And that's something that I also bring up, and I like the idea of mining the text for language and grammar, because that's, I mean, it's key. Through the literature, I really do point out a lot of these things. For things as simple as how do you spell a word like hasta, I keep getting it without the H. Mm-hmm. So when I come across it in the reading, I'll point it out. I'm sorry. Look how you write that. Look how you write that word, and I draw their attention to how it's written. Same thing for different types of grammar. Look at the way it's written there. To really get them to point it out, to make them aware of the grammar and aware of the spelling and things like that. And it's also the academic vocabulary, making them aware of the vocabulary that they need to have these kinds of conversations. To be able to talk about the setting that they need to know what the word is, ambiente, to understand that the difference between internal and external conflict, they have to have that terminology. And along those lines, I'd also like to point out that when I do introduce academic vocabulary, even though I do have a separation of language, I do teach those terms in both. So when I introduce one of the terms in Spanish, I will also tell them how that term is said in the other language. And again, that makes that awareness of how that term is used. So when they go to their English class and the teacher starts talking about certain concepts, they have the vocabulary to understand the concept. And it's not something that they think, oh, this is something that's completely new. It's the same idea. And along those lines is the cognates, making them aware of cognates that exist in both languages and teaching them the false cognates. One of my favorite examples of false cognates, of course, is a principal I had in the past who addressed a group of parents and said, I'm here to, and the word in English is support. Of course, in Spanish, the word is not. Soportar means we're going to put up with, we're going to tolerate you kids. To which, of course, the parents all, gasped and looked at each other. And of course, then we told they went up to this administrator and told them in their ear, what they had just said. To which, the coup d'etat turns to the audience and said, "Oh, I am so embarazado." Does not mean embarrassed, it means pregnant. And this was a man, mind you. So, again, the explicit teaching of this kinds of things, I think, really helps the students. And again, effective teaching and effective learning, and making sure that I'm giving the students what they need to have these kinds of conversations. And along the lines, the other thing that I also heard mentioned that is very true is the difference between code switching and the interlanguage. And I tend to find that a lot of times that's what I see with the students. Those who really have a high level of bilingualism will code switch purposefully, because one word has more meaning in the other language than the other word, but it's purposeful, versus the student who does it because of deficiencies. And it's really, as teachers, really being able to root out why are they switching the language to address or understand that's a good thing or that's something I need to address. But again, it's the constant diagnosis of seeing where these students are and again working with them. But again, for me, I always start with literature as the base. It gives them the vocabulary, it gives them the concept, it builds the prior knowledge they're going to need before we go into the writing, which is the productive, which, as you know, the harder thing to develop is the productive side of it, the oral and the written. So I always start from the receptive skills and work into the productive skills, and I do that. Probably read, write 3 different texts, 3 different focus essays throughout the year, even though while we're writing, as we're reading, and I'm looking at the writing to begin analyzing what am I going to have to teach them when I get to the explicit teaching of writing. It's an ongoing process. Of course, my advantage is I have my students for 3 years. I keep them as 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. So I know where I want to end up with them, and I know I have 3 years to get there.